and it holds the power of evil at bay. But if the coming of Christ Jesus isn't soon, they will try again to bring the church to doom. But no government can break it, and no evil power can shake it, for the Spirit of the Lord has been its stay. On the rock he said he'd build it, and the gates of hell can tilt it, but he's coming soon to take his bride away.
Well, you know, it's pretty hard to find a song about the church, so apologize for that. No, that's actually a nice little snippet of the late 60s or 70s. That affected style of singing. Sean Morris, honored stand-in for Resby. That's the way you learned to sing at Grove City, I'm guessing, when you were studying music there.
We did, you know, all those chapel choir rehearsals. They taught us, you know, Dr. Douglas Brown taught us in exactly this style. It was a thing to behold.
Well, good. Well, this is a Grove City show tonight because Sean Morris, my own associate pastor, he's a Grove City graduate, and we're honored to have, I don't think he was ever your professor, but certainly a mentor, T. David Gordon, joining us by phone. Dr. Gordon, are you there?
I am there, but at my size, I'm barely there.
So I should have also introduced you as the king of the short jokes, because you know them all. I mean, are they all committed to memory, or do you have a notebook of them?
No, I just have a special demon in charge of that, and he just pops up whenever he is.
Well, I think the little mini demons, those are imps, right? I think that's sometimes, well, we won't.
I think I've got those.
Only your immediate family members can call you things like that. But you're with us, and we're glad that you are with us. And we had some browser compatibility issues. That's why you're joining by phone. But we have the ability to make that work, and I believe it'll be just fine.
I'm wearing a white shirt and a tie and a dress jacket, and you can't even see it.
Yeah, well, that's but it'll add to the decorum somehow.
Yeah, I'm sure it will.
Well, give us a little bit. Of course, is there anything you want to say to the PhD in progress, Sean Morris? Dr. Gordon?
I wasn't sure if you were addressing Sean or me. I thought that
No, I wondered if you wanted to say anything to the PhD in progress, Sean Morris.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you know, Sean's relationship and mine is really sort of interesting because I think we both realized that he never actually took a course from me here, and we hardly met each other more than once or twice. So what's really interesting is I now regard Sean among my Grove City, former students, as one of the ones whom I have the most contact with. We email with some regularity. We see each other from time to time. And so I probably enjoy him ecclesiastically more than any of the Grove City alums that I've had. And yet I don't think he ever took a course from me. So it's really sort of odd that we now run in very similar circles as he developed theologically through his master's degrees when he studied in RTS Jackson. He came to conclusions on so many matters that are similar to my own. And, I can't take any credit for that, right? Because, I didn't teach him. He got this from Guy Waters and these kinds of folks. But the funny thing is, we're very close-minded, I would say, within the Reformed communions and within the Presbyterian tradition. Sean has developed in ways that if I had had a chance to influence him, he has developed in ways that I would have wanted him to develop. But unfortunately, I can take no credit for that uncanny reality.
Well, we have other mutual friends, but we won't go into all that because who knows what places that could take us. They've got their own podcast, and we'll let them deal with you that way.
And we will not mention by name the scourge of the South, Ryan Beasy. Also,
there you did it. And by invoking him, he may appear.
To say, be careful.
Yeah.
If you invoke his name 3 times, he shall manifest in front of us. So let's be careful.
I've got imps. I don't need Beasy.
Well, you, I mean, give us. I mean, we've spoken to you twice, I think, at least at conferences. We've recorded in person, but tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got to where you are. I mean, you're not the oldest guy around, but you're not the youngest, so you've been around. Tell us how you got to where you are. I mean, spiritual biographies and maybe a little personal too, as much as you want to share. But tell us how you came to be the now retired Dr. Gordon.
Well, Mom and Dad took us to church, all 4 of us. That was just, we grew up in a church home. They were real believers and Bible believers.
Now, where was this?
Richmond, Virginia. Actually, Bon Air, just across the river, but basically the Richmond area. And so then by the time I was in high school, in addition to the church, the mainline Presbyterian church that we were normally taken to as children, the Bon Air Baptist Church up on Buford Road had a pretty aggressive youth program, youth ministry, which was unusual in those days. We're talking the early 70s by then. And since it was walking distance to the house, I would kite off and worship with my parents in the morning and then walk up, 3 or 4 blocks over there to Bon Air Baptist, and kind of fell under Reverend Cochran's influence. So by the time I was heading for college, graduating high school in 73, I already had a sense of God's call for me to serve as a churchman. And so when I went off to college, I was basically Southern Baptist, for all practical purposes, and was assuming I would attend Louisville after graduation. And the college I attended was affiliated with the LCA, now the ELCA, the sort of mainline Lutheran tradition. And none of the people in the religion department believed a word of the creed, as far as I could tell. They called Bultmann Orthodox. And I said, well, Bultmann's not Orthodox. And they said, well, maybe Neo-Orthodox, And I said, well, what about Bart? And they said, oh, he's a fundy. And, so I mean, so I'm a Southern Baptist attending a college, which, by the way, is a very good liberal arts college and served me well. I tested out of both Greek and Hebrew by the time I got to Westminster. So Roanoke College served me well, but the religion department was not pushing me in a direction that I had planned to go. So I'm a Southern Baptist with a handful of charismatic friends in college at a liberal Lutheran college. And by late my junior year, I started becoming what I would now call Reformed, and which didn't please anyone. It just, and I actually had to go around looking for a place to worship, because unlike most normal people whose theology is influenced by the church they attend, it was a lot of my own study that brought me to the conclusions that I came to hold. I would say that Packer's Knowing God was very influential. I didn't realize it at the time, I don't think. But I now think that when I was reading, because that was just a collection of previously published essays. So in one sense, the book had no unity to it. But it's remarkable how many people read it as general evangelical people and became Reformed. And I think especially his chapter on the Second Commandment is what did it. I didn't realize it at the time, but it began. That chapter, I think, began a lifelong recognition to me, at least, though Jim Packer didn't use these words. But the way I put it is, all false religion is the human effort to have God on our terms, and all true religion is the divine effort to have us on his terms. And the Packer didn't use that way of putting it. I think that when I read his material on the Second Commandment, I became very convinced that as I looked around me and the varied influences on me religiously, there was what I now call true religion and false religion. That is to say, irreligion is actually rare. I mean, you know this, Brad, and Sean, you know it. If you look at human history, irreligion is extremely rare. People talk about the secular nature of our current European and American world, but that's very recent, actually. And many of these people check their horoscopes every day and astrology stuff and this kind of thing. So I actually think religion is almost impossible for the human. So what really happens is the God consciousness that is part of our nature is it gnaws at us and nags us, and it won't go away. And in my case, I think at some point when I embraced the Reformed faith, it was because it had this enormous distinction, a distinction you see in Dr. Van Til's thought, between the creator and the creature. So you have this infinite, eternal, and unchangeable creator and his finite, right, and temporal and very changeable creature. And only one of those two parties is competent to design religion. And so for me, to be Reformed is not in the first place to adopt Reformed soteriology, though for many people, I think that is for them how they would give their testimony, their experience, and so forth. I think it's much broader than that, and it was for Dr. Van Til. It's the basic notion that you see Calvin addressing in Book 1, of the knowledge of ourselves in terms of the Creator and our knowledge of the Creator in terms of ourselves and so forth. That is to say, God is the definer of what it is to be human. We are, after all, the image of God on a tiny little creature scale. So I think it's this big, huge, what I now know to be the Reformed tradition, but when I was in college, I didn't recognize it as such. But there was this big, huge difference between the human attempt to have God on human terms versus God not only attempting, but succeeding at having humans on his terms.
I think that's a fantastic point about worship being as important as soteriology. That's what Calvin says in Necessity of Reforming the Church. He actually puts the mode of worship before the means of salvation. And then if you've read Carlos Ayer, the Roman Catholic scholar, War Against the Idols, he identifies he doesn't use this word, but the genius of the Reformed as their view of the Second Commandment, and that being really the driver that for the Reformed Reformation, worship was as important as doctrine. And what I've come to realize is that if you don't worship properly, there's no way your theology proper is going to be right or be right for long.
That's correct. Yeah, that's right. We used to say that the law of faith, is the law of theology and so forth, and it's really true. In fact, in some traditions, I would say, for instance, the Orthodox Lutheran tradition, the Orthodox Anglican tradition, they really catechize through their liturgies. Yes, now Luther did have the short catechism, the small catechism, but basically they catechize through their liturgy, and we catechize by having the short and larger catechism, and sort of leave liturgy up there. So, in the PCA, for instance, you probably have as much variety as you would find in the mainline Presbyterian churches regarding worship. In fact, there was a time, let's say 25 years ago, I would say, if you wanted to know what Reformed worship was, you'd go to a mainline church rather than a NAPARC church, because they may not have known that their liturgy came from Calvin's Strasbourg liturgy, but it did come from it. And out of sheer inertia, these liberals that didn't believe a word of what the liturgy said, still used Calvin's liturgy or something very close to it. So yeah, I think that one of Dr. Van Til's really important insights that made him like Calvin was that God's sovereign over everything. And if correct me, Brad, if I'm wrong, if God is not sovereign over his own worship, he's not sovereign over anything. We are really only asked, in one sense, 2 hours a week to do things God's way rather than our way. It's not that big a deal to worship God as he has revealed. And yet people resist it tooth and tongue. And so I think the genius of our heritage is that there's a chastity, a chasteness, in that sense, a kind of humility that's part of our heritage that says, I'm just a creature. And Adam, before he fell, was still just a creature. And now we're not only creatures, but we're unholy creatures. And who in the world are we to design divine worship? And so almost everyone, even in many people in they part communions, when you ask them why they or their church does this, that, or the other, the answer is, well, many people like it. I'm thinking, the question is, does Yahweh like it? Does the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit like it? Why do we ask anyone else how to worship God? Okay. So that transition that hit me in my late college years.
Yeah, so let's get back to your authentically broken faith journey, as we like to say around here. How did you get into a church that took worship seriously, and how were you educated in the Reformed faith?
I think at that point, when I told some friends what my leanings were, they said, there is a church in this area. It's an offshoot of, I think, Grace Baptist or Grace Chapel. And they said, they have the kind of beliefs that you're talking about. And so I found out through someone how to find it. And it was a place where Richard Pratt was sort of planting a church. It was an RPES church at the time, I think it was RPC, yes. And so then I found someone in the Roanoke Valley for my last semester or semester and a half of my senior year, where there were other people who were nearly as weird as I am, though taller and nicer. And so I worshiped there and began to see the kind of what I call chaste worship, where if you ask, why do we do this, why do we do that, the answer was, to the best of our ability, we think that's what the Holy Scripture tells us is the mind of God. And we're trying to find the mind of God. Because if he's sovereign over everything, for goodness sakes, you have to at least be sovereign over his own worship.
So is this late 70s?
Yeah, I graduated from college in 77.
All right, so a lot of people think contemporary worship is new. Wild and crazy worship is fairly new. It was already among us at that time, right?
Yeah, we had, what was the guy's name? Randy something was, why should the devil have all the good music and that sort of a thing. In second chapter of Acts, published an LP. So even before cassettes and everything else, second chapter of Acts had, before I graduated, they had 2 LP albums pressed. So, this stuff is, in fact, the reason, in my opinion, I wrote a book about this, but the reason, in my opinion, that so many churches adopted so-called contemporary worship in the third millennium was because by then, the Jesus freaks / hippies, my generation, were now elders and deacons and pastors. And so there was never a theological argument for it. There was never an aesthetic argument for it. There was never anything other than the old quote, the old fogies had died. And now that we hipsters were running the church, we were going to do things the way we did it in college. So yeah, that stuff's in fact, it's almost odd to call it contemporary worship, because to me now, whenever I would see it, it's just not only associationally, it just bothersome to me because it just seems so disrespectful. But if I close my eyes, what I see is Eric Clapton and bell bottoms, right? I mean, it reminds me of the hippie era of the 70s. And of course, the younger people don't see that, and so it doesn't bother them in that way. I get that. But for me, yeah, when I see, quote, so-called contemporary worship, I said, this is the stuff that Larry Norman and others were promoting 50 years ago when I was in college, and that the second chapter of Acts was doing, and that sort of a thing. And finally, those people are old enough to be elders, deacons, and pastors in churches. And so they've never gotten over being hipsters. They've never gotten over being with it, hippie, Jesus freaks. And so they now want to make everybody a hippie Jesus freak. And I'm saying, good grief. Let the guy with his one little, tiny little 12-foot sailboat skip back and forth all over the place on a windy day. But the church should run like the Queen Mary crossing the Atlantic. It shouldn't just be darting all around because the wind's blowing differently today than it was yesterday. There should be something to the apostolic Christian faith that looks roughly similar in every generation and every culture. And my generation were people who had a real phobia for the past. We had contempt for it. Even the Christians among us, even the Christians among us, violated the fifth commandment more than any generation that had ever lived. We did not honor them. We disregarded them. And so we insisted on doing things in our own way. And so whether we did it in our own way in late 20th century garb or in someone's own way in 1837 New School garb, it's still wrong to have false religion. False religion always wants to have God on our terms, and true religion always wants God to have us on his terms.
All right, so we talked about Jesus freaks. So how did you become a Presby freak? That's what we want to know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that because I had a sense of calling to the ministry, and I knew that the college I attended, the professors there, the liberal Lutheran professors, were not Southern Baptists. And I knew that even the Southern Baptists were not crazy about some of the views that I was holding. And I said, if you're going to be ordained at some point, you have to stand in front of the building and represent a tradition. So whether it's Lutheran, whether it's Anglican, Presbyterian, Congregational, or whatever it is, a person who believes in God can basically attend almost any church, and that's okay because they're just attending. But the ordained minister has to find a church home where he can be a responsible advocate for its distinctive viewpoints. And so it was probably late junior year and early senior year when I said, I've got to find a church home. As I raised that question with people, said, yeah, you're probably a Presbyterian. You ought to find a Presbyterian church.
And
of course, some of the,
your friend and my pastor and Sean's colleague, Nick Wilborn, he came to Presbyterian convictions by reading the New Testament and had never heard of Presbyterians. And when he described it to someone, they said, oh, well, you're Presbyterian. So you all had exactly the same experience.
Yeah, in roughly the same time, because while he's a lot more youthful looking than I, Nick's probably only 8 or 10 years younger than I. What happened to me is, I recall, I mentioned Packer, but I also remember somebody we had very few people who attended church on Sunday. In a little college of 1,100 people, probably 5 or 6 of us went to a church. And someone at some point said, there are Calvinists causing trouble on campus. And I thought, I'm not sure what a Calvinist is, but if it's a Christian of any stripe, that's hardly trouble. Because, 900, 1,000 and 90 students sleep in on Sunday. So I said, what is a Calvinist? And said, well, they believe in predestination. I said, well, that's a kooky idea. So I opened, I don't know if I had a Strong's Concordance or a Cruden's Concordance at the time, but I thought, well, I need to deal with this. And I thought, well, of course it's not in the Bible. Now, I had read the New Testament twice, by the way. And then I noticed with the Concordance, the language of predestinating was actually in the Bible. So however we handle those texts and whatever we do with them, or however cleverly we dodge them, it was an absolute eye-opener to me that the language was actually in the Bible. So when my Baptist friends here and my Armenian friends here in Grove City said, well, I don't believe in predestination. I said, of course you believe in predestination. You believe in the Bible, don't you? And they said, well, yeah, but I don't believe in predestination. We have to believe in predestination. It's in the Bible. Just look it up in a concordance. It's there. Now, you may understand the doctrine differently than I do, but if you're a biblical Christian, you do believe and have to believe in predestination, because those whom he predestined, he also called. And so he obviously did predestine. And you may not like it, you may not understand it, or you may understand it differently than I, but you can't say it's not in the Bible, because this is just a fact check matter. It's there. And so I remember that in addition to the influence of Packer, there was this rustling about on the 7 or 8 of us who did attend church on Sunday. Somebody said, oh, there's some Calvinists here causing problems talking about predestination. And so that's when I started studying the scriptures about it, the way Nick apparently at a similar time in his life was just studying the scriptures, and led by nothing other than the Holy Spirit who inspired the scriptures and our own reading of them. We said, I've got to change. So we normally think of our growth in any area as additive. So, I spend my free time in the woods. I was out Monday night, and I was out last Monday night, and so forth. And it's true that in the woods, I've added some knots. When I first started going out, I think I only knew the taut line hitch, and then I learned a bowline knot, and Prusik knot, and so forth, and the trucker said some others. But there are many things in life where we grow not by addition, we grow by subtraction. And I would say over the last 40 or 45, 50 years, I've grown by subtracting. That what happened to me in college is I said, there are things that I believe that aren't taught in the Holy Scriptures, and I got to get rid of them. And so it's like the whittler. He's a little different than the person who throws clay and makes something out of clay. They could add more stuff to it. The whittler is constantly cutting stuff out. And what I began was a lifelong progress of cutting stuff out. Theological and religious ideas that I had just grown up with, and found out that there was no biblical justification for them at all. And in the process, what I realized was happening is I was coming to embrace true religion, imperfectly, of course. I still embrace it imperfectly every day of my life. But what I was embracing was an approach to religion that says, God has us on his terms. We do not have him on our terms. In fact, this is one of the small differences between confessional Lutherans and confessional Reformed. That Luther's entire approach to religion is, how do I find, right? How do I find a gracious God? How do I find a God who accepts me? And for Calvin says, if there is a God, who is he and what is he, and how do I submit to him? So Luther begins with his own existential problem and finds, much of the true and living God. There's enormous amounts of truth in Lutheran Orthodoxy. But Calvin doesn't even start there. He doesn't start with his problem and how is God the answer to it. He starts with the question, is there a being in this universe that is worthy of our worship because he is so profoundly different than we are. And that's why, as you alluded to earlier, Brad, in Calvin's treatise on reforming the church, he does mention worship before justification. And I think when they republished that in the early, like 25 years ago, and Bob Godfrey wrote the introduction, Bob called attention to that as well, that he put that first. And so that's a fundamental difference today between Lutheran thought and Reformed thought. Though, I mean, I love ACE. I'll be speaking at ACE next weekend. I spoke at ACE 5 weeks ago in East Lansing, Michigan. I love the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Love my Lutheran friends. Just love them. But we are different. And one of the differences is that the law gospel hermeneutic is basically a reflection of Luther's own psychology. It's not a reflection of Holy Scripture. And so it's a man-centered religion in that sense. It's driven by what the human needs. And for Calvin, religion should be driven by what the God who created all things says. And so does that religion also answer some of our needs? Of course it does. We feel as forgiven as our Lutheran friends do. But our whole approach as Reformed people is God has to be the only arbiter of his own religion and of his own worship. So here's my illustration, and either of you, Brad or Sean, can talk about the limits of illustrations. But my dad spent his entire professional career at A.H. Robbins Pharmaceuticals. They made Robitussin and Dimetap, those kinds of things. And they suffered a lawsuit in his last years there. It had nothing to do with him. He was the office manager. He ran the business side. He didn't know anything about chemistry. But when they reorganized after Chapter 11, they stopped having retirement dinners. So in most of the years that Dad was there, when a person had been there more than 20 years or 25, I don't know what the numbers were, but when people had spent most of their career there, or especially all of it, they had a retirement dinner, and they invited all of the people from their particular office and their spouses. So, probably 15 or 20 people, and they'd have a dinner somewhere and honor the person who'd spent his professional career there. So they didn't do it for Dad because they reorganized. But had they done it, here's what they would not have done and what they would have done. They would not have sent an email or a memo to all the people in Dad's office and said, when we honor Johnny on April 15th or whenever it is, what would you like for us to eat? Would you like pizza? Would you like Chick-fil-A? What would you like, right? We know that what they would have done is what they did to Dad's co-laborers, some of whom retired a few years before him when they still had these parties. They would have called my mom, and someone would have called and said, Trudy, we're looking at several dates to honor Johnny. Is the so-and-so date okay? Yeah, April 15th is fine. Now, what's Johnny's favorite food? What does he like? And Mom would have said, well, almost every Sunday after church, we have standing rib roast. And Johnny loves a good standing rib roast. And so if they had had a service honoring my father, they would have asked Mom discreetly what he wanted, and they would have served it. And my dad was a good man, and he was an elder in a Presbyterian church the last 46 years of his life. He was a very good man. But you know what? He was not the creator of the heavens and the earth. And yet, had he had a retirement dinner, they would have given him what he wanted. Why do we give God what we want? We treat God with less respect than we treat our fellow humans. If we have a 6-year-old grandson, we have a 6-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old grandson. Once a year on their birthday, we start to think we serve what they want. And they're only 6 years old. And if they want hot dogs, make hot dogs. If they want pizza, we make pizza. if we do that for a 6-year-old child who didn't make the heavens and the earth and all that's in them, why can't we consult God and ask him how he wishes to be honored? Why do we treat him with less practical respect than we treat a 6-year-old child? It just doesn't make sense. Unless the religious impulse can never be eradicated from the human. And so the religious impulse is part of Imago Dei, and therefore we will either embrace true religion and let God have us on his terms, or we will embrace false religion and try to have God on ours. But we cannot simply erase that religious impetus.
All right. So for your professional life, were you always teaching religion to college students, or was it Greek? Are you a biblical theologian? Are you a systematic theologian? Are you a generalist? How did you apply all this?
All three biblical degrees are biblical degrees. All three master's degrees: MAR in biblical studies at Westminster, THM in biblical studies at Westminster. Then I studied under Paul Ochtermeyer at Union Seminary in Virginia, and studied Paul's understanding of the law. It was actually a biblical PhD. We had Old Testament history, Old Testament introduction, Old Testament theology, as well as the same in New Testament. And while I was in grad school, I taught Greek. So I think the first time I taught Greek was 1981, and I retired in 2021, which means I taught biblical Greek for 40 years. My first position professionally after the PhD was to teach at Gordon Conwell. I went there in the fall of '84 and stayed there through the late '90s, and then came to Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania, and the last year of the last millennium. My first year here was 99, 2000, and at my age, I can't remember dates or raisins or prunes for that matter, but we only get a millennium every 1,000 years, and so even I can remember that my first year here in Western Pennsylvania at Grove City College was the academic year 99, 2000. And in the last 9 years that I was at Gordon Conwell, I also pastored a very small church plant. I didn't plant it. Two people had been there before me, but it was only 35 people when I went there, maybe 135 when I left 9 years later. But for the last 9 years at Gordon Conwell, I also pastored a tiny little Presbyterian church in southern New Hampshire. And then, I met Diane in college, not at the college, but I was attending Bethel Baptist Church where her dad was a deacon, and she was dating someone else at the time, so I kind of hardly noticed them. But at some point she stopped dating him, and we took an interest in each other. And so she was at a point in her Christian pilgrimage where she was asking questions about theology. So she read some of the stuff that I did, and grew weary of the kind of Arminian man-centered religion she'd been reared in. She was respectful about it to her parents, but she was very comfortable in accepting Reformed religion. So we married after my first year at Westminster Seminary. We were engaged before then. And so she was there with me in Philly for 2 years. I did 3 years of hard time in Philly, and she did 2 years of hard time in Philly. And then we went to Richmond for 4 years, and then went to Gordon Conwell. And then we started our first efforts to have a family were roughly in those years. And our first daughter was born on May 29th, 1986. 6 weeks later, we discovered she had a very severe form of leukemia that no child had survived yet. And so we went to Boston Children's with her and lived with her there for 8 weeks until she passed away on September 4th, 1986. And then God eventually gave us the courage and grace at some point to try again. We were so heartbroken that I still to this day don't remember whether I raised the question with Diane or she raised it with me. But I'm sure whichever of us raised it, the question was actually incredibly ambiguous. It was something like one of us said to the other, "So what do you think?" And then the other one just had to decide that what that meant was, are we willing to be that heartbroken again? And somehow God gave us the grace to try again. And so the next little girl who came along, we named her Grace. And because the letters that Robert Louis Dabney wrote to his brothers when Robbie and Jimmy died within several weeks of each other, roughly a month, I had become a student of Dabney's on my own. And when Marion was an infant, I got to the point in Clement Reed Vaughan's biography of Dabney where he wrote the letters to his brother Charles about the death of Robert, and then several weeks later, a month later, Jimmy. And the letters were just so candid about the utter grief and yet hope in Christ that as I was reading them, I came inside and said, Diane, can I read this? And she was changing little Marion at times. It was like Marion was 5 weeks old. At the time, we thought perfectly healthy. And when I read the letters that Dabney wrote to his brother, we both wept and said, how could he suffer that so early in his adult life and then go on to serve the church as he did? And then 6 days later, we found out that we were going to lose our first child. And so when our third daughter came along, she's now Dabney Ann Gordon, now Dabney Gordon Schlee. She's married. But yeah, Grace was married, was called Grace because 88% of the marriages with a terminally ill child, the marriage itself fails, much less having more children afterwards. So when God gave us the grace to try again, we called her Grace.
I was going to ask you about that because I remember learning that when I was fairly young, that very few marriages survive the death of a child, even Christians. So you found out early on that theology matters.
Yeah. And, particularly when I was at Westminster and Dick Gaffin taught his course on Acts and Paul, the last week and a half or two, I can't remember that precisely now, he lectured on suffering as a constituent part of the ordinary Christian experience. So he was lecturing on Paul, really. Peter would say, don't consider it strange, brothers, when this happens, right? You shouldn't consider it strange. And I remember that Dick's lectures on that were just so compelling and so well done that I remember that I sort of embraced at that point the reality of, he didn't use this language, but what some people would call a cruciform life is a Christian life, or a Christian life is a cruciform life. That if we want to be like Christ, the man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, we have to be people of sorrows, and we have to be acquainted with grief. This is what happens. So I think Dick's lectures that Diane and I discussed, years before we had Marion, before she died, were really so helpful to us. I remember writing him a thank you note after Marion had died, expressing my appreciation for that. When a person falls off of the boat that's crossing the Atlantic, you don't throw him an uninflated life raft and say, blow that thing up, you need it. At that point, he needs an already inflated raft. So I don't think pastorally that we can give people a positive Christian doctrine of suffering when they experience suffering for the first time. We need to give it to them before they suffer. We need to inflate that raft so that when they are storm-tossed, as it were, the raft has already been inflated. And in the providence of God for us, it was Dick's lectures and his course on Acts and Paul, and especially the last week and a half or so on suffering as a constituent dimension, from Philippians 3, in order that I may know him in the power of his resurrection and in the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to the likeness of his death. So that it really did help us. There was not only the invisible grace of the Holy Spirit that gave us the courage to try again, to be heartbroken by bringing other children. Because we just didn't think we could survive if we had that grief again. We were just so heartbroken. Diane had claustrochondritis, I think they call it. She literally almost had a broken heart after Marion died. She had some kind of inflammation in the tissues around the heart that she had to have medication for. And I didn't have that. But for the next 3 years or 2 years when I lectured at Gordon Conwell, when I prayed at the beginning of the class, I think it was 3 years before I could pray without at some point pausing because I'd lost my composure and had to get started again. We were absolutely heartbroken because when she was born, she was the most beautiful little thing we've ever seen. And then when she was 6 weeks old, we found out that we would likely lose her. And 8 weeks after that, we did. And we were just crushed. And yeah, we would have barely survived our marriage, much less have had the impetus to have other children after that. But God's very gracious to poor stupid sinners. He knows that we're only dust.
I assume the church was a great comfort and help to you even at that time.
Yeah, they were great. Yeah, we were attending the OP church there in Hamilton before they moved up on 1A and built a bigger place. They were on Railroad Avenue there in Hamilton at the time, and Jim Kern was the pastor, and he was very good to us. The elders were good. And at Marion's memorial service, I had realized that I wrote the pastor a letter each week from the hospital, basically, updating him, and just to let Jim know. And I found out later that he read those every week to the people in the congregation. And the congregation had been going through some hard times before that because it was the only Bible-believing church almost north of Boston, but certainly north of Peabody area. So on the North Shore proper, it was the only Bible-believing church. And so there was this constant kind of tension in there because the real OPers wanted it to be a distinctly Reformed and Presbyterian church. And the Bible-believing people from Gordon College and Gordon Conwell wanted it to be a general evangelical church. And so there was tension there in those days. But apparently, as we were writing our letters back up there and the pastor was reading them each week, some people apparently thought, we had a bigger fish to fry. And life and death, especially the death of a child, really does make petty look petty. And so at Marion's memorial service, Meredith Kleining came up and expressed his sorrow for our loss. And he said, "Your daughter's life and death were a great victory for the communion of the saints." And so Meredith thought that what happened was this church that had been divided before came together because they loved this poor little young couple that were at Boston Children's, singing and praying to and with their little baby before she died. So yeah, the church was just profoundly supportive, and the Gordon Conwell Seminary community was remarkably supportive to us. They were just wonderful. Couldn't have been better.
So none of this is disconnected from our topic, because what we want to talk a little bit about is the church, her spiritual nature, and you were thankful for a church that had a spiritual mission at that time. And of course, they did things for you physically and provided different types of aid. But it was the spiritual ministry and mission of the church that was your help at that time, I'm quite sure.
Right. So when I mentioned Dick Gaffen's lectures, for instance, probably 4 or 5 years before that, well, much more, because I did 4 years of doctoral study after Westminster, and then we were there. So Dick's lectures are probably 5 years before that. But the solid teaching of the Holy Scriptures, the truths of the Word of God, just change things. They just make things different. And there wasn't one sentence in Dick's lectures where before he delivered the lecture, he thought, what do the students want to hear? That's just not who Dick Gaffen is, right? And so the whole approach in my years at Westminster was this is the religion that God has revealed to us through the Holy Scriptures, and we do the best we can to follow it. So yeah, um, um, it, it's a real, it's a different kind of a religion. Um, Even though many people, I think, embrace false religion, they want to have God on their terms. I think they also know that if you have, quote, God with a small g on your terms, he isn't God. If all you're getting is what you know is your creaturely wish, this is the God we wish existed, then when you need a God who actually exists, you realize you don't have one. All you've got is the God that you wish existed. And so, yeah, I think that our our Reformed heritage is even stronger than our Lutheran friends' heritage, even though I love my Lutheran friends. And the confessional Lutherans have some wonderful confessions. Um, but there is still a kind of a man-centeredness to Luther's basic approach to religion. And there's this God-centeredness to Calvin's approach that I think makes it the only religion that actually, ironically, serves us well. Because if we live in a universe that is not God-centered, we need a religion that isn't man-centered. We need a religion that is God-centered.
That's probably why Luther's such a compelling character, so entertaining.
Yeah.
But, Calvin is not, yet there's, we can all see ourselves in maybe the somewhat selfish, self-centered, earthy Luther, but it's a little harder maybe with Calvin, although
Right.
we appreciate him.
Had he not studied theology, Calvin would have been a CPA. He would have done people's taxes.
Yeah.
Right. Just not an interesting person as a person. And Luther's a ton of fun. And so, yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right that when you read any page in the 52 volumes of whatever it is of Luther's Werke, you see Luther on every page. You don't see Calvin anywhere in the Institutes. He is as absent from the Institutes as Shakespeare is from his stuff. Shakespeare had incredible insight to what it is to be human, but when you read his plays, you have no idea what he was like. None at all. He's an utter enigma. He's completely clothed in obscurity. He's the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. And Calvin's the same way. Calvin helps us understand God, but Calvin didn't even have enough interest in himself to put his own name on his gravestone. I mean, that's just the most remarkable thing. That if people visit Geneva today and they ask a tour guide, can you take us to John Calvin's grave? Because we're Presbyterians and we would like to see it. And they'll say, he insisted that it not be marked. And so no one knows where it is.
All right, so to bring all this together, we've talked about the sort of regulative principle of worship, but that can lead to, I've become increasingly convinced, a regulative principle of church government, but also a regulative principle of the mission of the church. And that's what the spirituality of the church really is about. So let's turn to that. I suppose you consider yourself a Southern Presbyterian. Spirituality of the church, for good and less good reasons, has been a hallmark of Southern Presbyterianism. But you feel strongly about this, and you're not afraid to to contradict the zeitgeist, I guess, on this particular issue. And you were compelled to write an article, and it was about a protest you filed against a very popular measure. It was an overture that the PCA General Assembly passed last summer, which led to a commission drafting a humble petition for federal and state governments that presbyteries and the stated clerk, etc., were supposed to send as they felt led to state and federal governments concerning the transgender issue, especially children, sexual. I don't know. There are no good words for any of this. Gender reassignment, mutilation, puberty blockers. All these. There are positive and negative things to speak of these heinous things. But that's the gist of it. It was a statement against transgender surgeries and treatments for everyone, but especially for young people. And
I think the focus was, for instance, any medical procedures that would disrupt the ordinary biological development through the years of puberty, because those are the ones that some of them, at least, if you disrupt the normal human growth during that time, some aspects can never be reclaimed. So the good parts of Overture 12 from Evangel Presbytery and to the General Assembly were the fact that they didn't give a shotgun approach to transgenderism in the culture at large per se, but they narrowed their focus, especially to those treatments that might prevent a young person from developing fully, right, which might actually permanently retard their ability to become a full human physically, emotionally, and psychologically. And so for its substance, I think 99 to 100% of those of us in the NAPART communities would have said, for substance, the overture itself from Evangel Presbytery was spot on and well written. And then as the General Assembly fine-tuned it a little bit, it was still excellent in my judgment. Had it been sent to our churches, which are under our jurisdiction as council, I think it would have been a wonderful thing to have done. So it's very important to say that you can disagree with an overture that addresses the civil magistrate because that's what it does, without disagreeing with the substance of what was said in that. And so I don't disagree with the substance. And so the reason this is so hard for people to wrap themselves around, Brad, is that we normally think of the various societies and sub-societies as just growing naturally in human life, the way acorns fall off of oak trees and eventually become oak trees. But in the Holy Scripture, it does recognize three human societies that are different from all the others. All the rest, their origin is in humans. The Boy Scouts of America, the origin is in humans. Grove City College, the origin is in humans, and so forth. But there are three societies that God institutes. He institutes the family in Genesis 1 and 2. He institutes the state or the civil magistrate in Genesis 9. And he institutes the visible church somewhere between Genesis 12 and Genesis 17. There were believers in the invisible church before, but as Stuart Robinson says, until circumcision is required, a public rite, you don't have a visible church really until Genesis 17. And so the issues regarding what God institutes are very different than what the Lions Club does, or what the Chamber of Commerce does, or what the PTA does. All of these human societies that arise out of the human desire to have a better life. Of course, if their origin is human, they can do whatever humans want with it. But if God institutes family, state, and church, then we may only do in those societies what God instituted them to do. And so there was a time when this is what distinguished the old school from the new school. If you look at the so-called new measures that divided us eventually by 1837 as Presbyterians, the point was that not necessarily that they were wrong, but they were new. If they were new, they couldn't have been apostolic, right? By definition. And so the old school said, no, God the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit knows how to govern his own church. And he has presented the apostles, according to Ephesians 2, as the foundation of that church. And so we are content with saying the Word of God, taught and preached, prayer, and the two sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper are instituted by God as the means by which he gathers and perfects his saints. And the only reason we would need new measures is if the apostolic measures were inadequate in some way. And it's just impossible, not just implausible, it's impossible that Christ's appointed apostles wouldn't have known how to do church as well as we do. And so the original 1837 division over that point was over this very matter. And so it wasn't over the new measures per se, it was over the question of whether we needed any measures other than apostolic measures. And so that goes back then to what I call true religion versus false religion. True religion is when God has us on his terms. False religion is when we try to have God on our terms. And that's what the 1837 division was about. There were those who simply had the confidence that God knew how to gather and perfect his saints, and that he might know as much how to do that as we did. And so that was the real issue. And it remains a tension, not so much in the other NAPART churches. I think the URC is pretty well squared away, and the OPC is very squared away, and on this point, and for a longer time. But the PCA has never figured this out. I remember back at the end of the last century, we had a series of General Assemblies where there were overtures regarding women in the military. Sean, you're too young to remember this, but Brad, you remember this, and it was just one after another. The original Kuwait War, then Iraq, then Afghanistan, and these overtures about women serving in the military. And I served on bills and overtures several times in those years. And one year I was elected chairman. It was in a fit of indiscretion by those present. And I think because I've been secretary for the 2 previous years, and this was the booby prize for doing the hard work of keeping minutes. And so when one of these overtures came up, to tell Congress not to let women serve in the military, I said, I've got nothing to lose now. I'm the chairman. And so the overture came from 2 presbyteries, not one. They jointly authored it. And I said, the moderator, the chairman rules the overtures out of order on the basis of Westminster Confession of Faith 23:1. And I thought, well, certainly someone, and there was a pause, just a kind of stunned silence. I said, if you're unhappy with the chair's ruling, the proper form of the motion is, shall the chair be sustained? Then I would entertain a motion to that effect if anyone would like to make it. And no one did. No one did. We didn't even discuss the matter. And so then later on the floor of General Assembly, when I'm presenting the Bills and Overtures report, when we got to that one, when they got to that item, I said, the chairman ruled it out of order because it was out of conformity with our confession of faith, and no one challenged his rulings, so that's why we have nothing before you. And no one challenged it there. And even there, I said, if you're not happy with my ruling, the proper form of the motion is, shall the chair be sustained? And no one did it. And so all it took was one tiny little 5'3" chairman who was willing to say, I'm going to start with the assumption that our confession of faith is right, and make the other people prove the contrary, rather than it always being the people who don't believe the confession, and we're the nitpickers in the back of the room trying to hold everything up, right? So
this is a radical approach that you've taken here.
That's right. And the funny thing was, they debated that 2 or 3 years before, and 1 or 2 years afterwards. They kept debating it, and I haven't attended this since. So I don't know how the matters were finally resolved. But I do know that during those same years, we never, ever addressed whether the Kuwait Iraq or Afghanistan war satisfied the criteria of just war. And so we had no opinion on whether we should be at war or not, which I regard as a significant matter. But we were darn sure we didn't want women serving in it, even as quartermasters. So the whole thing, from my point of view, as an old school Presbyterian, was just crazy. It was just crazy.
So you might say, to draw the worship analogy, it's an issue of modesty,
Yes.
or staying in your lane. That's a very that of course,
Right.
down in what is it, down in Katy, Texas, there's a 26 lane freeway or something like that. So maybe you have to stay in one of the 26 lanes. Maybe that's the new standard.
Right. So the point of staying in your lane is the PTA can do anything that the state legislature permits it to do. But if God institutes the family can only do what God instituted it to do. And if he institutes the church, it can only do what he instituted it to do. And if he institutes the state, it can only do what he instituted it to do. So the problem is we have no doctrine of institutions. And as a consequence, then, we just view all human societies as human societies. And the only question we raise is, well, would it be good if this society did X, Y, or Z? And so one of the reasons that I didn't even debate the matter on the floor of our presbytery before I protested it is because there's no point in it. If people haven't already thought about the question of institutions versus voluntary societies, then there's just really no point in really arguing the matter, because all you get is blank stares. And so I have decided, for the sake of conscience, as I get older, I'm just going to start protesting these every time they happen. And I'll change the names to protect the innocent, as it were, because it'll be Overture 14 next year and Overture 6 the next year and so forth. But the basic substance of my reasoning would be germane to all of them. That it is not the church, when it gathers in its several powers, is to handle matters that are ecclesiastical.
Yeah.
And advising them is just not something we're supposed to do.
It occurs to me that the Great Commission is really not. It's about the church, not just about what the church is supposed to do, but it's quite limiting. I mean, it's very modest, to use your word, and
yes,
it's not.
Chaste.
It's chaste. Okay, yeah, you broke up a little bit there. So with Christian nationalism and culture wars and all that stuff we hear about today, I was called a biblicist for saying, well, where in the New Testament does it say we're supposed to do this or that in society, or address the government, or take over the government, or be the moral policeman for this or that nation? And but I think that's an important question. If I don't see the Apostle Paul assigning these tasks to us, I'm a little worried sometimes. So, am I off base there, or is that the way you view it?
Yeah, I view it the same way, Brad. When I was teaching the course on Presbyterian polity at Gordon Conwell for, I would say, roughly a decade. By the way, this is before Guy Waters wrote his wonderful book on church polity. It's very good. I would love to have had it when I was teaching those years, but it came out, afterwards. I had long left Gordon Conwell by the time that book came out.
Yeah, I taught a whole Sunday school series on that book, How Jesus Runs the Church.
It's just really wonderful, but it wasn't available when I was teaching, so I had like a 25 or 26 page bibliography, and it was mostly periodical articles from the American Biblical Repository, the Southern Presbyterian Review, the Princeton Theological Review, and so forth in the 19th century. And then I did quote some of the older books of the 17th and 18th century, most of which were out of print. But I had I had Rutherford's Do Rights of Presbytery in the original 1644, but the binding had been redone in the Edinburgh Library, but I had the pages were printed in 1644. And I had Gillespie's Aaron's Rod Blossoming. One of the things I did in those years is I looked in the scriptural index to such books for Matthew 28:16 through 20. And I found in every case exactly what you found, Brad. It never appeared in discussions of missions or evangelism. It always appeared in the portions on the nature and limits of church power and authority. Isn't that amazing? A passage now that is the standard post-Billy Graham proof text for world evangelism. And by the way, I'm not opposed to world evangelism. I think it's a great idea. But they saw it as Jesus authorizing these 11 apostles, because I think they'd lost one by then, what he authorized them to do and what he didn't authorize them to do. And so it actually appeared in the 17th and 18th century in discussions of ecclesiology. It did not occur in discussions of missions or evangelism.
Yeah, I didn't know that, but I mean, it makes sense.
It's absolutely fascinating. And of course, you recall that in Bannerman's 2 volumes on the Church of Christ, the first big section of the first sort of book 1, as it were, is on the nature and limits of church power. And then he gets to the nature and limits of church power as it regards to discipline, the nature and limits of church power as it regards public worship and so forth. But the whole thing begins with the question of if God authorizes a group, what does he authorize it to do? And so the reason for my protest is if the local PTA had come up with a similar thing, it wouldn't have bothered me because they're not authorized by God, so they can do whatever they want. But we're the Church of Jesus Christ, and we can only do what he's authorized us to do. And so as individuals, every one of us could have taken the Overture 12 and sent it to our elected representatives, and it would have been perfectly proper for us to have done so in our several powers, but not in our joint powers. When we gather in our joint powers, we are to deal with matters that are ecclesiastical.
Okay, so that's several and joint. That also applies to officers. In other words,
Yes.
the session of elders or the presbytery or the General Assembly can speak to something, but then individual officers can minister individually. They need to be, careful that you don't speak for the session or the presbytery or the General Assembly without authorization. Our stated clerk shouldn't be a sort of pope who makes pronouncements on things. So there's several in joint power with officers, but the same applies to church members. And you would not limit individual officers or certainly individual church members or even groups of church members or officers who might band together to address a certain issue in a certain way. But as Presbyterians, we have an understanding that to have the church, you need to have the court. The local church doesn't exist without the session. The broader church does not exist without the presbyteries and the General Assembly. So that several and joint thing, which you'll find if you read the PCA, PCO, and I'm sure lots of older works of ecclesiology, but that's an important distinction.
It's a very important distinction, and it's in mostly Chapter 3 of the PCA, BCO, and our BCO. But it goes back to the second book of discipline in the Scottish Church in 1578. And so and I think I quote that in my little essay describing why I protested. I quote those things because from 1578 on, Presbyterian books of discipline and government, especially books of government, made a very clear distinction between what we do in our several powers and what we do in our joint powers. So in our several powers, you're an elder, for instance, and I was an elder for a couple of years at Stony Point. Um, I could go visit people who were in the hospital or who had a newborn child and go and visit with them and pray with them and that sort of a thing. We don't need a vote for the session that say, go do that. I still remember when Howard and Jackie Griffith's first son, Alex, was born back when I was an elder at Stony Point, and was one of those who helped him plant All Saints Church later. I went over to the hospital and congratulated and prayed with him when Alex was born. He wasn't even a day old. He was less than 24 hours old, and we prayed for that little boy. And you see that in our several powers, severed from one another on the session, we can do all sorts of private things on the basis of our own wisdom and discretion. But when we gather and the meeting is called to order, now we have gathered in our joint sense, and what we bind on earth is bound in heaven, etc. And so it's a very, very different kind of a thing. And it goes back, as far as I can trace it, to 1578. And that distinction is found in Presbyterian books to this day. And so the problem is that many of our men, good men, by the way, very good men at the sessional Presbyterian General Assembly level, they just never thought about these issues. I'm sure their eyes have glanced across chapter 3 of the Book of Church Order before, but they have no idea what it means and why it's in there. And they don't know that it's been there since 1578. And so they don't realize that this is a very significant matter. It's profoundly different what T. David Gordon does as an individual citizen of the United States. I can write Governor Shapiro here in Pennsylvania if I want to and tell him whatever I want to tell him. But I can't ask the president to tell him what.
Machen did that very thing in that very state. I mean, he protested jaywalking laws. He testified before Congress against the formation of the Department of Education. Yes,
and he did it on his own. The Presbytery did not appoint him to do that. He didn't act on behalf of Presbytery. He just got up on his own as a citizen of Pennsylvania, of the Commonwealth, and he articulated his views, and he did the same thing in Washington, D.C. with Congress. For substance, I thought Evangel Presbytery wrote a very, very fine thing, and I thought the commission that the moderator appointed refined it in a very good way. I think for substance, it's a very, very pastoral and theologically sound document. The point is, when the church gathers in its joint power, it is to handle only matters that are ecclesiastical, and this is not an ecclesiastical matter.
All right, so that's your basic argument, that this is not church business. So, how would you answer those that said, well, the federal government's action on this, it norms things in society, it affects public schools and the healthcare industry, and it's going to actually affect the church, and that it will affect the members of the church. It will make children more liable to come under the sway of this sort of thing, especially in public schools. It'll make people who work in the healthcare industry, it'll make it harder for them to stay out of this mess. How would you answer that?
It sort of goes in two directions, doesn't it? One direction is what we say to those who sit in the seats of government. And if we just ask, for instance, how does it affect them? One letter from one or two or three presbyteries. So let's say 3 letters from 3 presbyteries in Pennsylvania. I think we have 3 PCA presbyteries in Pennsylvania. How does that influence your elected representatives? Suppose every member, ruling or teaching elder of those presbyteries wrote letters to the same people, and they got hundreds of letters. which would influence them more? One letter or hundreds of letters? Well, anyone who's been around politics, I was a page in the Virginia legislature in 1970. So I've been around it. I've seen how it actually works. I can tell you they count noses, right? So if on the one hand, the question is, how do we bear influence? Aaron Wren is right. We now live in the negative world. And so the legislature in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, cares no more about what our presbyteries say than it does about what the local mosque says, or the local synagogue says, or the local Roman Catholic Church says. But if they get hundreds of letters, I guarantee you, they would start considering the matter. So the irony is, if you were asking, how do we make the culture we live in better? The way to make it better is to be a citizen. It's to be a citizen and to write them as a voting citizen who can vote them out of office. They care about that. They don't care about what a group of 40 presbyters say at some point. They just don't care. So that's one side of the question of that. Then the other question is sort of the side of the question of, well, how do we do what we can in our power as citizens for our own behalf and that of our own children? So now we're not so much thinking about how do we influence our legislators, but how do we create a good home for our people and so forth, that kind of thing. Well, we get involved in all sorts of kinds of things, right? In other words, we don't need to lasso the church into our concern. We could have lobbying groups equivalent to the National Rifle Association, but don't care about the Second Amendment, but care about other things. That is to say, there are many other things that we can do to influence legislatures and therefore influence the localities in which we exist that do not require the church to declare its mind on the matter. And we can also just recognize that when the state passes really stupid laws, we can either unseat those who do it, or we can just not obey them, right? Submitting to law does not mean you obey it. When the apostle said, whether it's right before God to obey you rather than God, krenate, you decide. But in other words, they submitted to the fact that the magistrate may throw them in jail, but they did not give him the obedience he required. And so, and that's one of the great benefits of our doctrine of God instituting family, state, and church, is that he institutes the state also, but only to do certain things. And when it steps outside of that arena, we just say, with all due respect, I'm not going to do that. You stepped outside of the bounds God has given you. And so, yes, you decide whether to put me in jail or not, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to obey you. So the remarkable thing is there's a very close relationship to all this to our Westminster doctrine and Reformed doctrine of Christian liberty and liberty of conscience. That insofar as we submit to these three societies that God has instituted, state and family and church, that also liberates us from all the rest of it. And it liberates us even from them when they step outside of the bounds for which God appointed them. And that's why this matter is important. And that's why I protested, because if we, as the church, instituted by God in our joint power, do not respect what God instituted us to do and not do, how can we expect anyone else to respect it? Because we haven't done it ourselves. I even heard one or two men, and they're good men. You can tell by the tone of my paper that I think was on the Quill Report. I love this presbytery. It's a good group of men. I'm very fond of them, and they were so kind to me in 2023 when I moderated. They were just great, and I really do love them. But I just couldn't help but wince every now and then when someone speaking to the question of Overture 12 would rise and say, well, I'm not sure I know how to read the Constitution, whether this is prohibited or not. But I think And I thought, if a person stands and publicly says, I don't know what the confession of faith says or means, this is why we have the privilege of abstaining. Such a person should not advocate for something when one of the oldest people in the presbytery, who had also, the only one in our presbytery, who taught Presbyterian polity for 10 years at a theological seminary, when he says this is out of order, contrary to the law of the church, you don't say, I'm unsure, therefore I'm disagreeing with it. You say, I'm unsure, and therefore I abstain.
Well, one of the big issues, and I think where I was convinced that the humble petition was okay, was that the cases extraordinary clause or phrase in chapter 31. It said that we don't intermeddle in public in the affairs of government unless one of the qualifications is cases extraordinary. So I think you probably want to address that because, the argument was transgenderism is a creation level issue. It affects everything. It goes right to the beginning. God created, them male and female. So surely if anything is an extraordinary case, this is it. So I think that's the strongest argument for it if you take a surface reading of cases extraordinary.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Brad. I think that was one of the strongest parts of that. Whenever I had conversations about this, I've said, look, for substance, this overture was extremely well written. It was extremely well written because if you think about it, if you look at the creation narrative, let us make man in our image after our likeness. So in the image of God, he made them male and female, he made them. So the overture itself for substance, I thought, was almost eloquent in its putting the emphasis on that syllable. They were right that not all moral issues strike at the foundational nature of creation the way transgenderism does. And so I think that's absolutely well taken. The problem is then, in cases extraordinary, there's either, as I put it, a sort of a subjective reading of that, or there's a more objective reading. So, for instance, if you say this is more heinous than other things, I would go to the portions of the larger catechism that say, why are some sins more heinous than others, and what are the qualifications and so forth. But let's assume we still adopt that sort of subjective understanding. I want to know if did you realize that at the Super Bowl this year, the amount of money wagered on the Super Bowl was more than the annual budget of 2 or 3 of our smaller states in the United States of America? Now just think about that. The total amount of money on one sporting event exceeded the budget of several states. And how many families are destroyed by this? So if you compare that, for instance, to how many young people are transgendered and how many families, if you just Google how many people bet on the Super Bowl and the amount of money, you would say, why did we protest the 15 or 20 young people who are transgendered annually and not address something that was bigger than the annual budget of several states, right? So for me, the problem with reading extraordinary is, it really bothers me, is that's all it means. My complaint about our civil governments, state, sometimes local, and certainly federal, but actually I think local governments do a lot better. I think most of the concentric circle wise, they do better. But one of the problems is they take items and they're very passionate about them. And I want to say, why do you care about this? So, as someone who owns several firearms, for instance, all the people up in arms about firearms laws and trying to eradicate the Second Amendment, I'm saying, well, are firearms really that big of a deal, right? So, oh, yes, they say 35,000 people died in firearms incidents last year. I said, yes. But what were the three major categories? The three major categories, numerically, were people who took their own life, people who were killed by their spouses, and people who were committing a crime in the process of committing crimes. In other words, drug dealers shooting each other.
Hold on. I think we should ban spouses.
Okay, yeah, right. Yeah. So if you remove those, we're now down to something like 4,000 or 5,000 people a year die through the criminal use of firearms. And yet, well over 500,000, by the smallest numbers, firearms are used to prevent crimes. And some figures, Gary, what's his name? Koch, the guy up in Indiana, he thinks it's over 1 million. Over 1 million times, Andrew, but the smallest figure is 400 to 500,000, 500,000. The firearms prevent a crime. And so it's 10 to 1 ratio at least, and maybe 20 to 1, that they make us safer. And by the way, 90% of the ones where a firearm prevents a crime, the gun isn't even fired. It's just a person breaks into someone's home, they point a gun at it, and the person runs off. So why are people so excited about that and not excited about cars? Because 43,000 people die annually in automobile accidents, right? And if your wife doesn't kill you, if you don't kill yourself, and if you're not a drug dealer, you're 10 times less likely to die than you are in an automobile. And so why doesn't the Congress look at all of the deaths that occur each year? Because these stats are available. Say, starting at the top of the list of those who don't die of natural causes, what are the things that are most likely to kill people that we ought to be concerned about, right? And so similarly, I think if the church, if they don't read the Confession of Faith as I do, if they don't read 31:4 as I read it, and if they just think it's up for discretion, still, why do we select the things that we do? And so in this case, the best part of Overture 12 out of Evangel Presbytery is the part you referred to. That they did say, theologically, this strikes at the very nature of the human as imago Dei. And in that sense, the thing was a brilliant treatise to be sent to all the churches. But does the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, how orthodox our statements are, when many of the other citizens are not Christians, but are Islamic or Jewish or unaffiliated? So the notion that because it's theologically significant is a great notion if you sent Overture 12 to the churches in the PCA, right? But it's when you send it to the magistrates that I'm saying they don't care how pure this is with respect to the Christian religion, because our First Amendment even says that religion can't be used to prohibit a person from holding office.
All right, so here's a question. What's the harm that can come from the church intermeddling in any number of things, whether it be the magistrate, social issues, business, maybe even, just sounds crazy, but the arts, or getting into the real estate business? There are churches who open grocery stores to serve underserved areas. What's the harm when the church? And I'm not saying that there isn't any, but what is the harm that can occur when we get out of our lane?
Yeah, I think the harm is that since unlike God, because he's infinite, eternal, and unchangeable, we're not infinite, we're not eternal, and we're not unchangeable. So the simple matter of facts is I get about 16 hours a day of waking life. I'm roughly asleep for 8 hours. And so in a 24-hour a day, we really are only in some sense conscious for 16 of those. And so the issue is, do we do in those hours what is best and wisest for us to do? So if you translate that to the church, the point would be this. If we spent 4 hours at General Assembly last summer in floor debate over Overture 12, and who knows how many hours in Evangel Presbytery and how many hours in the Overtures Committee, and then how many hours in each of the presbyteries that the stated clerk sent it to. How many man hours were devoted to something that we aren't called to do that could have been devoted to what we are called to do? So remember that John only records this. The other Gospels don't. But it's so like our Savior. What a remarkable thing that since Peter denied Jesus 3 times, Jesus very, very considerately gives him 3 opportunities to make the matter right, doesn't he? And so, so when he asks him, "If you love me," he does it 3 times, and in each time he says, "You're right, you do. So feed my lambs, tend my sheep, and then feed my sheep." So Lewis was totally wrong on the use of the 2 verbs there, because note that the direct object in these cases, the verb "feed my lambs," I think it's Bosco there, and then "tend my sheep," Poimino, and then he blends the 2, feed, Bosco, and my sheep, my proboscis. And so the point was, you prove your love for me by your care for the flock. And so whenever in our joint meetings, not our individual work, that's a different thing, but when we gather as sessions, presbyteries, or general assembly, and we expend energy that is not directed to our flock, but just to the world in general, we don't love Jesus as much as Peter did. Because when we gather in our corporate nature, it's to serve the flock. And that is an honorable enough thing to do that we don't need anything else other than to say the church is the bride of Christ. And if we love him, we love his bride. And we will let others deal with institutions and societies that are not his bride. But we have the privilege of feeding and tending his flock and his sheep, and that's what we're going to do. So one of the things that concerns me so much about this is my fear, and this is just my own fear, maybe no one else feels this way. My fear is our churchmen don't think it's important to be churchmen. That the only way they can justify their existence is if they send a letter to, in our case, Governor Shapiro, or to the legislators out in Harrisburg. And I'm thinking, brothers, you're called to feed the flock of Christ and to tend his sheep. And that should be sufficient to you in your joint powers. And if as an individual afterwards you want to do some other things, that's fine. You can be a scoutmaster with the Boy Scouts if you want to. That's fine. But we don't expect a session to address the Boy Scouts. So, yeah, it's not so much that it does positive harm, but if we spend, I mean, how many total man hours went into Overture 12? How many drafts did it go through at Evangel Presbytery? Because it's very good. Other than sending it to the magistrate, it's very good. So some smart people must have spent a lot of time on it. And then it went through Overtures Committee, and a lot of presbyteries evaluate these things before General Assembly. How many hours went into that? And then how many hours went on to that? And how many hours went on to the special process of the moderator appointing a special? How many? We probably spent more hours on Overture 12 at our last General Assembly, more man hours on any other thing. And yet it wasn't word, it wasn't prayer, it wasn't sacrament. And we spent more man hours on it. So what does that tell the church, and what does it tell the world? It tells our churches and it tells the world that we who are ordained officers in the church don't care about the church. That's what it tells them.
You know, I think, I don't believe there's a present danger of this, but if this overture were the beginning of a string of this sort of thing, where we begin to mimic the mainline denominations of the 60s and 70s, where it seemed like nearly monthly they had a new position paper on this or that, and a lot of those were done by committees, or, you know, we know the PCUSA is nearly an Episcopal church at this point. They're so top down, but we certainly don't want to get to the point that the mainline churches were in, where they just became, political think tanks commenting on political issues, and we see where that got them. I don't think that's going to happen here, but that is a reasonable concern to raise, I believe.
Yeah, it's a concern of mine. On the little paper that Dominic put on the Aquila report, my third section deals with the historical consideration, and it focuses on Charles Hodge's protest of the Gardner Spring resolutions. It's really very, very fascinating that the Spring resolutions, Gardner Spring resolutions, the second one of the two especially, says that Christians owe their allegiance to the federal government rather than their state government. And of course, the Bible doesn't address the American experiment at all. It came 2,000 years earlier. And so the question of whether one's primary allegiance to, quote, the powers that be, because that expression does appear in Romans 13, right? If we're to submit to the powers that be, we have to decide, if the federal and the state disagree, to which do we submit? And Charles Hodge's point was, the Bible doesn't answer whether our allegiance to the federal government is greater than our allegiance to our various state governments. Because back in the days of 13 colonies, before steam engines, before railroad and these kinds of things, the only governing authority you knew was your state and local authority. You even in the early years of the Republic, when you had a relation to the other 12 colonies, you really didn't know much about them. And so his point was, the church is not authorized to determine that your duty to the federal government is greater than the duty to your state government. And he was right. There's nothing you can't answer that question. And so, but they dove right in and they answered the question. And so the consequence of the spring resolutions were that many of the northern churches with old school sympathies left the communion and joined the Confederate Church in the United States. They joined the Southern Presbyterian Church. And in less than a decade, less than 10 full years, there was a reunion in the North between the old school and the new school, because the old school had basically vanished. And so the historical result of declaring that the church's mind on certain matters need not be informed by Holy Scripture. It may address contemporary matters that the Holy Scriptures didn't even envision. What happened is, within less than 10 years, it led to the demise of that church, at least in its older sense, because in the reunion, they didn't resolve any of the issues that had separated them in 1837. They just ignored them because the old school group had left and gone elsewhere. And so Hodges' language is incredibly strong. It's remarkable, right? We deny the right of the General Assembly to decide the political question. To what government the allegiance of Presbyterians as citizens is due, and its rights to make that decision a condition of membership in our church. And so that he said each person has to decide whether his primary allegiance is to the federal organization versus the state. So in those days, the federal organization was kind of like today what we would consider NATO. Yes, the United States is a member of NATO. We're also a member of the United jurisdictions that we have in our New York City, and so we make alliances with these groups. But if you ask a citizen of the United States, are you more committed to the United States than you are to NATO? There's no way from Romans 13 you could answer that question. And that's the way that question was at the time. And so the Hodges said, we're not going to take extraordinary cases in a subjective sense. We're going to take it in its lexical sense, and it's in the sense that the 17th century, when they were all trained in Latin when they were kids and stuff, they knew it. So if God has ordained something, hear the English, if he has ordained something, it is ordinary to do what he has ordained, and extraordinary to do something that he did not ordain, right? And so both Hodges, Charles Hodge and his son A.A. Hodge, took the case as extraordinary to mean where the state stepped outside of its bounds in a manner that impeded upon the church, and vice versa. They didn't mean extraordinary to mean unusually sinful, because of course, if you adopt the view of original sin, sin is universal. Everyone sins. I think in my paper I mentioned that even Ms. Swift says haters gonna hate, right? So it's not extraordinary that sinners sin. It's just what they do, right? It's extraordinary when the state intrudes upon ecclesiastical matters. And it's extraordinary when the church it extends itself on civil matters. It's extraordinary. It's out of what is ordained. And at least that way of reading it, which both Hodges did, is the kind of thing that you have a reasonable chance of relieving yourself of subjectivity. And so, as A.A. Hodge put it, he described extraordinary as things that directly affect the church. So I think the example that I use, and I think it's a fair example, is that during COVID, the governor of Nevada shut down the churches and would not permit them to meet on Sundays. But he did not shut down the casinos. He continued to permit them to meet. Well, COVID germs are COVID germs. It doesn't matter the condition of your soul as to whether you pass them on to someone else or not. And so it was just preposterous for the civil authority to tell the ecclesiastical authority that they couldn't meet. And they should have all told him to take a long walk on a short pier, and they should have continued to meet if they wanted to do so.
Well, there are no piers in Nevada, though. That's
right. That's true, because there's no water out there, I understand. And so if they did have a pier, it would be a short pier. So in other words, I think Westminster 31:4 does permit us to object and to petition the state when its policies prevent us from doing what we do. But the state addresses all of its citizens. Its jurisdiction is different from that of the church. And it is not our responsibility to tell it how to govern people who are not in the church. We would have had every right to send Overture 12 to every presbytery and to every church in the PCA because they were all under our jurisdiction. But we had no authority to send it to the magistrate saying, here's how you should care for people who are under your jurisdiction. We just had no authority to do that. So inevitably, unfortunately, I'm not predicting that the PCA will go as liberal as quickly as the mainline Presbyterian Church did between 1861 and 1870. I mean, they went totally off the rails in 9 years. And within 50 years, even defrocked J. Gresham Machen. So it's just amazing how completely bust they went. I'm not predicting that. And I'm not a fear monger. And I'm not saying that my objection to this is because if we don't view the matter as I do, the church can fall apart. God can protect his church. He has the ability to do that. But in the past, when those who are authorized to govern the church abuse that authority to do anything that wasn't given them to do, it tends to make them lawless. And that's T. David's problem, is I'm already too lawless. What I need to be is more lawful and more restrained. And so most of us who suffer from original sin, which is all other than our Savior, realize that it's always good to restrain ourselves because our problem comes from our lack of doing so. So when the church, which is supposed to set an example, doesn't restrain itself, it's sending entirely a wrong message. It's just the opposite. They should say, we're not sure what you should do as individual citizens in notifying your congressman, but here's a very good paper describing how we feel about the matter as Christians. And if you want to write him, go right ahead. But we have no authority to tell him how to govern his citizens. If nothing else, that would set a great example.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good place to wrap up. I'll just say that when people say, "Well, the church ought to do something," what they mean is the preachers ought to do something, because we've all got whether we're Roman Catholics or former Baptist or whatever, we all think it's about the pastors. So we want someone else to do it for us. And I think a great point you made, and as you were making it at the time, I was impressed that we could have gotten our people much more involved in this than to impress them by saying, "Look what we did." It could be what the we could have been everyone. Church members getting involved, and we have people do that. Our church doesn't. We don't, as the church, we don't go out and protest against abortion or something like that. But we encourage our members to be involved with some anti-abortion events as church members, and we could do that with this too, I think. So Sean Morris has been unusually quiet because he's been enjoying smoking that pipe, and he's been batting away the bugs. He's about, as the crow flies, he's about 12 miles from where I sit now. It's buggy here in the sunny, humid South. Sean, any last questions or observations for Dr. Gordon?
Well, I've been enjoying it so much, which is why I sat back and just have been taking it all in. Dr. Gordon, I know the hour is late, and there's lots of questions I'd love to ask. Let me, if I could, and it's probably terribly unfair because you don't have the book open in front of you, but about half an hour ago, you mentioned Bannerman and his Church of Christ, that wonderful volume, and I recall on a podcast a few weeks ago, you mentioned that in Bannerman's book, he has this section where he outlines these enumerated principles where the church and the state may have cordial relations or a friendly alliance. Do you recall? And again, it's unfair because the book's not in front of you. But do you recall at all if Bannerman has any insights or wisdom in his principled argument there about when's the appropriate time for the church to petition the state in in the context of these friendly relations?
Well, he's writing within an Erastian context, of course,
Right.
and so, but the fascinating thing is, even the original edition of the standards, the magistrate was given responsibility to see that religion was properly affirmed and so forth and functioned. But the converse wasn't true. The state, the church was not, had no responsibility for the church. And so I think that he's actually a little ambiguous at parts of there, but in part one, the nature of the church, and a little bit in part two on the power of the church, then in each of those places, he does normally have a little bit about the relation of the two. So in part one on the nature of the church, it's chapter 8 that's called the church and its relation to the state. And so that's the place where we get Bannerman's fullest discussion of that matter. And yet it is written, remember, within an Erastian context. And yet he talks about spiritual independence, liberty of conscience, and so forth. And he's favorite of the doctrine of the Westminster Confession on the church and state. But remember, when he wrote that, the Westminster Confession didn't have the American changes in it.
Right.
We could do another full show on that.
Yeah.
Oh, surely. Yeah.
But it's interesting. Charles Hodge did say, and I can't find it where he said it, but I'm sure I got it from Charles Hodge years ago. But almost in passing at one point, he said the only contribution of the American churches to Christian theology was its clear separation of church and state, which is really a remarkable statement. Because, he said at Princeton, there was never a novel idea proposed. So he was quite a conservative in the ordinary sense, and yet the one contribution of the American churches was its clear distinction between ecclesiastical jurisdiction and civil jurisdiction.
Yeah, and that is remarkable because, as you said, establishmentarianism runs long and deep in the Presbyterian tradition, and so if that's the one great contribution, the one distinct contribution of the American tradition, that is quite something.
Well,
right.
Sean, one of our mutual friends who's on the live chat tonight and who has spent a good deal of time in Scotland, he says that the established nature of the Scottish Church was one of the reasons for its declension and decline, not any sort of hedge against it. So that's what Hodge is talking about. That it's actually a protector.
Yeah, because what happens then is in Germany, in the British Isles, several of the others, old Protestant places, the good people that bring us the post office bring them church. Now, I like the people who bring us post office. They're nice people. But they have a cushy job because they're civil servants. They have great health benefits and retirement benefits and stuff. And they learn not to make any waves, right? And so complacence and conformity are the way that you have a long career in civil service. And it can be the post office, it could be working as a prison guard, whatever it is. And so imagine if you're living in a country where the kind of people who bring us our mail or who guard prisons run religion. No one would want that. Many people inherited it, but no one would want that. I mean, these are the least self-motivated, self-governing, visionary people you'll ever meet. These are people who've learned to get along by going along. And while I like them all fine, I mean, I love the folks who work in our post office here in town. And I've got a buddy that I just met this year who spent his entire career as a prison guard. And I like them all fine. But I can tell you what, they haven't an ounce of initiative in them, right? There are people who are bred to make no waves. who are bred to just go along. And so to think that there are cultures where those are the people who bring you the church because it gives them a comfortable life. That's the reason.
Yeah. And we can't forget total depravity.
Right.
It applies to institutions and established churches and Christian princes and all these things as well.
It applies to Sean's dog.
Well, my dog has been snoring loudly all night. Resby can always hear that and points it out, but most of you probably missed it. But he loves podcasting. He loves the sound of these voices for some reason, and it puts him right to sleep. And maybe some of you all too. And at this hour, we've probably put a few to sleep. But
yeah,
but Dr. Gordon,
I did it for years.
We want to thank you for joining us, and Sean for being here. You know, my security blanket, my Resby. I didn't call you by the name of my dog, which I often do with Resby. So consider
That's
yourself. That's a real compliment to you. And yeah, we could just do monthly shows, Dr. Gordon, and we would never run out of things to talk about. I'm quite sure. And
I'm sure I'll fall asleep on another occasion.
And we'll have you hooked up for a video through the browser next time, and not over the phone. Although it sounded fine, and you've been a trooper to work with us in that respect. So, well, let's just play ourselves out with a little more about the church. Again, there aren't many good songs about the church. Stuart Robinson says it's an essential element of the gospel of God, so maybe we should have more songs about the church. But in the meantime, as Resby always says, stay Presby and don't be an Erdman.
For the Spirit of the Lord has been its name. On the rock he said he'd build it, and the gates of hell can tilt it, but he's coming soon to take his bride away. But he's coming soon to take his bride away. Yes, he's coming soon to take his bride away.
What's wrong with you people?